The old Greyhound bus groaned to a stop at Millbrook Station, and a man in faded jeans stepped off carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag. His calloused hands gripped the strap tight. No one recognized Michael Carter. Not the gas station clerk, not the neighbors walking by, not even the town that watched him leave 20 years ago with empty pockets and a broken heart. He wanted it that way. Somewhere across town, in a house with fresh paint and a Mercedes in the driveway, his parents sat counting their blessings. The same parents who once told him they wouldn't waste money on a dying woman, his wife, his Ethan's mother. Now Michael was back, dressed like a beggar, with $180 million hidden behind his silence. He wasn't here for revenge, he was here for an answer. And what his family would do next would shatter everything he thought he knew about blood and loyalty. The August heat pressed down on Millbrook like a wet blanket, and Michael Carter stood at the edge of the bus station parking lot, letting the familiar humidity sink into his bones. 20 years. 20 years since he had breathed this air, walked these cracked sidewalks, looked up at the same rusted water tower that still read, Millbrook, population 4,200, in faded white letters. Nothing had changed. The gas station on the corner still had the same flickering sign. The oak trees along Main Street still dropped their acorns onto the same uneven pavement. And somewhere in this town, his parents still lived in the same house where they had told him he was on his own, that his dying wife was not their problem, that poverty was a choice, and he had made his bed. Beside him, a 15-year-old boy with dark hair and his mother's eyes squinted against the sun. Ethan had never been to Millbrook. He had heard stories, fragments of a past his father rarely spoke about, but he had never seen the place where Michael Carter had grown up poor, married young, and buried his dreams alongside his wife. The boy shifted his backpack on his shoulder and looked at his father, waiting for an explanation that didn't come. Michael simply started walking toward the edge of town, where a motel with a crooked vacancy sign promised cheap rooms and no questions asked. Ethan followed without a word. He had learned long ago that his father spoke through silence, and sometimes the silence said more than words ever could. The Starlight Motel sat at the end of a gravel road, its faded blue paint peeling in long strips that curled like dead skin. Michael paid for a week in cash, the bills worn and soft from years of handling, though they came from a wallet that could have bought the entire motel 10 times over. The woman behind the counter barely glanced at him, just slid the key across the laminate surface and went back to her crossword puzzle. Room 12. Ground floor. A bed with a mattress that sagged in the middle, a television that only got 3 channels, and a window that looked out onto an empty parking lot. Michael set his duffel bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching his father's face for some sign of what came next, but Michael's expression was unreadable, a mask he had worn for 12 years, ever since the night he held Catherine's hand, and felt her slip away while his mother's voice echoed in his ear. "There's nothing we can do." Your father said no. The next morning, Michael walked into town alone. He had told Ethan to stay at the motel, to read, to rest, to wait. The boy had protested, but Michael's voice had carried a weight that left no room for argument. This was something he needed to do himself, at least at first. He needed to see them. He needed to know if anything had changed in the 2 decades since he had sworn never to return. The walk took him past the elementary school, where he had learned to read, past the church where he had married Catherine on a spring afternoon when the dogwoods were in bloom, past the cemetery where she now lay beneath a simple stone that bore her name and the words, beloved wife and mother. He did not stop at her grave. Not yet. There would be time for that later, after he had his answer. The house on Maple Street looked exactly as he remembered, except better. Fresh paint, white with green shutters, a Mercedes sedan gleaming in the driveway like a trophy. The lawn was immaculate, the hedges trimmed, the flower beds bursting with color. Robert and Gloria Carter had done well for themselves, it seemed. They had always cared about appearances, about what the neighbors thought, about the careful curation of a respectable life. Michael stood across the street for a long moment, watching. A curtain moved in an upstairs window. Someone was home. He crossed the street and walked up the driveway, his worn boots scuffing against the concrete, his faded jeans and threadbare flannel shirt announcing his poverty before he ever opened his mouth. He rang the doorbell and waited. Gloria Carter opened the door and stared at her son as if she were seeing a ghost. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the faint stirring of a memory she had tried to bury. But the flicker died as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cool assessment that traveled from his uncombed hair to his scuffed boots and back again. She did not smile. She did not reach out to embrace him. She simply stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, blocking the entrance to the house where he had grown up. Behind her, Michael could see the living room, the same furniture arranged in the same positions, the same family photographs on the mantel. Though he noticed, with a dull ache, that his own picture was missing. The wall where his graduation portrait had once hung was now occupied by a landscape painting of mountains he had never seen. Robert Carter appeared behind his wife, his face hardening the moment he recognized his eldest son. The old man had aged, his hair now completely white, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes held the same cold judgment they had carried 20 years ago. He looked at Michael the way one might look at a stray dog that had wandered onto the property, with annoyance, with contempt, with the absolute certainty that this creature did not belong here. "Well," Robert said, his voice flat and unwelcoming. "Look who finally decided to show his face. 20 years, and you come back looking like you've been living under a bridge. Still can't get your life together, can you? Some things never change." Michael said nothing. He simply stood there, absorbing the words like blows, cataloging each one for later examination. He had expected this. He had prepared for this. But expecting a knife and feeling it slide between your ribs were two very different things. Gloria shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the neighbors' houses, as if worried someone might see this ragged man standing on her doorstep. "Michael," she said, her voice tight with something that might have been embarrassment. "This isn't a good time. We have company coming for dinner. Perhaps you could come back another day." She didn't invite him in. She didn't ask where he had been, how he was doing, whether he had eaten. She didn't ask about Ethan, her only grandchild, the boy she had never met because she had chosen her husband's pride over her son's pain. Michael nodded slowly, as if he had expected nothing more. "I just wanted to let you know I was in town," he said quietly. "I'm staying at the Starlight Motel, room 12, in case you wanted to talk." Robert snorted. "Talk about what? How you threw your life away on that woman? How you could have had a future if you'd listened to us instead of thinking with your—" Gloria put a hand on her husband's arm, silencing him. Not out of kindness, Michael knew, but out of propriety. The neighbors might hear. Michael turned and walked back down the driveway, his shoulders straight, his pace unhurried. He did not look back. He could feel their eyes on him, judging, dismissing, confirming every belief they had ever held about their disappointing son. That woman. That was what his father had called Catherine, not his wife, not the mother of his child. Just that woman, as if her entire existence could be reduced to an inconvenience, a mistake, a stain on the family name. Michael walked all the way back to the motel before he allowed himself to feel anything, and when he finally sat down on the sagging bed and looked at Ethan's worried face, he simply said, "They haven't changed." Ethan didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. The next morning, Michael went looking for work. Not because he needed the money. The accounts in his name held enough to fund a small country. but because he needed to understand something. He needed to know how the people of Millbrook treated those who had nothing. He needed to see this town through the eyes of the poor, the way he had seen it 20 years ago when he was young and desperate and begging for help that never came. He walked past the hardware store and the bank and the new coffee shop that had opened on the corner until he found himself standing in front of a small diner called Mabel's Kitchen. The sign in the window said, "Help wanted, dishwasher." Michael pushed open the door and stepped inside. The woman behind the counter was 72 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and hands that showed decades of hard work. Mabel Hutchins had owned this diner for 40 years, serving breakfast to farmers and lunch to factory workers and dinner to anyone who walked through her door with an appetite and a few dollars to spare. She looked at Michael with eyes that held no judgment, only curiosity, and asked if she could help him. He pointed to the sign in the window. "I'm looking for work," he said. "I can wash dishes. I can clean. I can do whatever you need." Mabel studied him for a long moment, taking in his worn clothes, his calloused hands, his face that carried the weight of years and grief. "You got a name?" she asked. "Michael," he said. "Just Michael." She nodded slowly, as if that were enough. "You ever worked in a kitchen before?" He shook his head. "But I'm a fast learner." Mabel smiled, and in that smile, Michael saw something he had almost forgotten existed. Simple, human kindness. "Well, Michael, just Michael," she said. "You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning. I'll pay you what I can, and you can eat whatever's left over at the end of the day. Fair enough?" It was more than fair. It was more than anyone had offered him in this town in 20 years. That evening, Michael brought Ethan to the diner for dinner. Mabel served the meatloaf and mashed potatoes, and when Michael reached for his wallet, she waved him off. "First meal's on the house," she said. "You looked like you needed it." Ethan stared at the old woman with something like wonder. He had grown up in a world of wealth, where kindness was often transactional, where every gift came with strings attached. But this woman, this stranger who owned a diner in a forgotten town, had given them food simply because she could, because she wanted to, because that was who she was. Later, as they walked back to the motel under a sky full of stars, Ethan asked his father a question that had been building inside him all day. "Dad," he said quietly, "if Grandma and Grandpa think being poor is so bad, why are the poor people we've met so much nicer than them?" Michael looked at his son, at this boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn heart, and felt something loosen in his chest. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said. "Keep watching. The answer will come." The days settled into a rhythm. Michael woke before dawn and walked to the diner, where he washed dishes and mopped floors and listened to the conversations that swirled around him like smoke. Mabel talked about her late husband, gone 10 years now, and how she still set a place for him at the table every Sunday. The regulars talked about their jobs, their children, their worries about money and health and the future. They talked about the Carters, too. Robert and Gloria, the couple in the big house on Maple Street, who had more money than most folks in town but never seemed to share it. "Remember when Mabel asked them to donate to the food bank?" one man said, shaking his head. "Robert told her to stop begging and get a real job, said people who needed charity didn't deserve it." Michael kept his head down and scrubbed a pot until it gleamed. He said nothing, but he remembered. Ethan spent his days reading books that Mabel lent him from a box in the back of the diner. Dog-eared paperbacks that smelled of grease and age. He helped sweep the floors sometimes, or refilled the salt shakers, or just sat in a corner booth and watched the people who came and went. He was learning things his expensive private school had never taught him, that wealth and worth were not the same thing, that generosity did not require a fat bank account, that the measure of a person could be found in how they treated those who could offer them nothing in return. He watched his father work alongside Mabel, two people separated by age and circumstance, but united by something harder to name. Dignity, maybe. Or just the stubborn refusal to be broken by a world that kept trying. One afternoon, Michael walked back to Maple Street. He carried a small bag of fruit he had bought with his dishwasher's wages. Apples and oranges. Nothing fancy, but chosen with care. He rang the doorbell and waited, and when Gloria opened the door, he held out the bag like an offering. "I wanted to bring you something," he said. "To say thank you for everything." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he said them anyway. Gloria looked at the bag as if it were contaminated. Behind her, Robert's voice boomed from the living room. "Who is it? If it's that beggar son of yours, tell him we don't need his charity!" Gloria took the bag with 2 fingers, holding it away from her body, as if it might stain her dress. "Thank you," she said stiffly. I'll put this in the kitchen." She did not invite him in. She did not ask about Ethan, about his health, about his life. She simply closed the door in his face, and Michael stood on the porch for a long moment, staring at the green shutters and the gleaming Mercedes and the life his parents had built on a foundation of contempt for anyone who had less. That night, long after the town had gone to sleep, Gloria crept downstairs to the kitchen. She stood in the darkness, holding the bag of fruit her son had brought, and something cracked inside her that she had spent years trying to ignore. She opened the bag and lifted an apple to her nose, inhaling its sweetness, and suddenly she was crying. Silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and fell onto the linoleum floor. She opened a drawer and pulled out a photograph she had hidden there years ago, a picture of Michael on his graduation day, grinning at the camera with Catherine by his side, both of them so young and so full of hope. Gloria traced her son's face with a trembling finger and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. She thought about calling him, about going to that motel and telling him she was sorry, that she had made a terrible mistake 12 years ago when she hung up the phone while his wife was dying. But then she heard Robert coughing upstairs, and she put the photograph back in the drawer, wiped her eyes, and went to bed. Some cages are built by others, but we choose to stay inside. The news spread through Millbrook like wildfire on a dry August day. Robert Carter had collapsed in his living room, clutching his chest, and the ambulance had taken him to the county hospital with its sirens screaming. A stroke, the doctors said. Not fatal, but serious. He would need surgery, rehabilitation, months of recovery. And the bills, even with insurance, would be staggering. Gloria sat in the hospital waiting room with her hands clasped in her lap, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the door through which they had wheeled her husband. The doctor had mentioned a number. $40,000 out of pocket, just for the surgery. She had money, yes, but not that much liquid. Not without selling something. Not without asking for help. Michael heard the news from one of the regulars at the diner, a man who worked at the hospital as an orderly. He listened without expression, then finished drying the dishes he was working on and hung up his apron. "I need to take a break," he told Mabel. She nodded, understanding something in his face that he hadn't spoken aloud. "Take all the time you need," she said. "Family is family, even when they don't act like it." Michael walked to the hospital, his worn boots eating up the miles, his mind turning over possibilities like cards in a deck. He had the money. He could write a check and make all of Gloria's problems disappear. But that wasn't why he was here. He was here to watch, to see, to know, once and for all, whether his parents were capable of change. He found Gloria in the waiting room, smaller than he remembered, older than he had let himself notice. She looked up when he entered, and for a moment her face crumpled with something that might have been relief. But then it hardened again, the walls going back up, the mask sliding into place. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice flat. You can't help. You don't have any money. Michael sat down across from her, leaving an empty chair between them. I heard about Dad, he said. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Gloria laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. Okay? My husband is in surgery. The bills are going to bury us. And my only son is a dishwasher. She spat the word like a curse. Michael absorbed it the way he had absorbed everything else. Quietly, patiently, filing it away for later. If I had money, he said carefully, would you want my help? Gloria stared at him. Don't be ridiculous. You don't have money. You've never had money. You married that woman and threw everything away. That woman. Again. Always. Later that day, something happened that shifted the ground beneath Gloria's feet. Mabel Hutchins arrived at the hospital carrying a container of homemade soup. She walked right up to Gloria, set the container on the table beside her, and said, I heard about Robert. I thought you might be hungry. Gloria stared at the old woman, as if she were speaking a foreign language. This was the same woman her husband had humiliated at the town meeting 10 years ago. The woman he had called a beggar and told to get a real job. And here she was, offering food, offering kindness, offering exactly what the Carters had always refused to give. I don't need your charity, Gloria said, the words coming out by reflex, by habit, by the training of a lifetime spent looking down on those who had less. Mabel just smiled, a sad smile that held no anger. It's not charity, she said. It's just soup. Take it or leave it. She turned and walked away, leaving Gloria alone with her pride and her fear, and a container of soup that smelled like everything she had ever denied herself. When Robert woke from surgery, the first thing he saw was Gloria's face, drawn and pale. The second thing he saw was Michael, standing in the doorway, still wearing his dishwasher's clothes, still looking like the failure Robert had always believed him to be. What's he doing here? Robert croaked, his voice weak but his contempt still strong. I told you, Gloria, I don't want him around. He's an embarrassment. Michael stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. I came to see if you were okay, Dad, he said. That's all. Robert turned his face away. I don't need anything from you. You couldn't help if you wanted to. You don't have 2 nickels to rub together. Michael nodded, as if this were a fair assessment. What if I did? He asked quietly. What if I had enough to pay for your surgery, your recovery, everything? Would you take it then? Robert laughed, a wheezing sound that turned into a cough. You? With money? That's the funniest thing I've heard in 20 years. Get out of my room. I'd rather die than take a penny from a failure like you. Michael did not get angry. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Simple white stock, elegant black letters. He placed it on the table beside his father's bed and waited. Robert picked it up with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the words, his face slowly changing from contempt to confusion to something that looked like shock. The card read, Michael Carter, Chief Executive Officer, Horizon Tech Industries. Robert stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. This is a joke, he said. This has to be a joke. Michael shook his head slowly. No joke, Dad. I started that company 15 years ago. It went public 8 years ago. Forbes values it at about $180 million now. I just thought you should know. Gloria made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. But you work at that diner. Michael looked at his mother with an expression that held no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep and abiding sadness. I wanted to see who you really were, he said quietly. I wanted to know if you had changed. I wanted to believe that maybe, after all these years, you had learned something about what really matters." The room fell silent. Robert's heart monitor beeped steadily, marking the seconds as they stretched into minutes. Gloria reached for Michael's hand, her fingers grasping at him like a drowning woman reaching for a lifeline. "Michael," she said, her voice breaking. "Sweetheart, why didn't you tell us? We're your parents. We love you. We've always been so proud of you." Michael pulled his hand away gently but firmly. "Proud of me?" he repeated. "You were proud of me when I walked in here yesterday, looking like I didn't have $1 to my name? You were proud of me when you closed the door in my face? When you called my wife that woman?" Gloria's face crumbled. We didn't know. We thought—" Michael's voice remained steady, but something dark flickered in his eyes. 12 years ago, he said, "I called you from a hospital room in Chicago. Catherine was dying. The doctors said they could try one more surgery, but our insurance wouldn't cover it. I needed $30,000. That's all, just enough to give her a chance." He paused, letting the memory rise up, letting it fill the room like smoke. "Do you remember what you said, Dad?" Robert's face had gone gray. He didn't answer. But Michael continued anyway, the words flowing out of him like water from a cracked dam. "You said you wouldn't throw money at a dying woman. You said I had made my choice when I married her, and I had to live with the consequences. You said—" Michael's voice caught, just for a moment, before he steadied himself. "You said, some people aren't worth saving." Gloria was crying now, tears streaming down her face, her hands twisting in her lap. "Michael, please," she whispered. "We didn't mean. We never thought she would actually." But Michael was looking at his mother now, and his eyes held something she had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but a profound and unshakable disappointment. "I called you, Mom, after Dad hung up. I called you back and I begged you. I said, please, just talk to him. Just convince him. Just give us a chance. And do you remember what you said?" Gloria shook her head, but Michael knew she remembered. He knew she had carried that memory with her for 12 years, locked away in a drawer alongside his graduation photograph. "You said, 'I'm sorry, Michael. Your father won't change his mind. There's nothing I can do.'" He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And then you hung up. And I sat there holding the phone, listening to the dial tone, while Catherine—" He stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his young face pale, his eyes moving from his father to his grandparents, and back again. This was the first time he had heard the full story. His father had protected him from this truth for 15 years, giving him only fragments, only shadows. But now the light was pouring in, harsh and unforgiving, and Ethan was seeing his grandparents for who they truly were. Michael straightened up and took a deep breath. "I'm going to pay for your surgery, Dad. All of it. The hospital, the rehabilitation, whatever you need." Robert started to speak, but Michael held up his hand. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because Catherine would have wanted me to. She believed in forgiveness. She believed that people could change. She was a better person than I will ever be." He looked at Gloria, who was still crying, her mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks. "But I have one condition. Mabel Hutchins, the woman who owns the diner where I've been working. She brought you soup today. And I know Dad threw her out of a town meeting 10 years ago for asking for donations to the food bank. You owe her an apology, both of you. Not because I'm asking for it, but because it's the right thing to do. And if you can't do that, if you can't learn to treat people with basic human decency, then this is the last time we'll ever speak." He turned and walked toward the door where Ethan was waiting, but Gloria's voice stopped him. "Michael, wait." Please." He turned back, one hand on the doorframe. Gloria was looking at him with something new in her eyes. Not the cold assessment of before, not the embarrassment or the contempt, but something that might have been the first stirrings of genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. About Catherine. About all of it. I should have fought harder. I should have stood up to your father. I should have been there." Michael studied his mother's face for a long moment. "Words are easy, Mom. It's actions that matter. Show me you mean it. Start with Mabel." And then he was gone, walking down the hospital corridor with his son beside him, leaving his parents alone with their guilt and their choices and the terrible weight of 20 years of wrong. 3 days later, Gloria Carter stood outside Mabel's kitchen, with her hands trembling at her sides. She had spent those 3 days arguing with herself, with Robert, with the voice in her head that kept saying she had done nothing wrong, that she had only followed her husband's lead, that she was the victim here. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Michael's face in that hospital room, not angry, not vengeful, just sad. The sadness of a man who had hoped for something and been disappointed yet again. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. Mabel was behind the counter, wiping down the coffee machine, and she looked up with the same calm, unreadable expression she always wore. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if Gloria Carter had never humiliated her, as if Robert had never called her a beggar in front of the whole town. Gloria's carefully prepared speech dissolved in her throat. I wanted to say," she stopped, started again. "My husband was wrong to treat you the way he did, and I was wrong to let him. I'm sorry." She paused, struggling to get the next words out. "And thank you for the soup, and for being kind to my son when we weren't." Mabel set down her rag and looked at Gloria with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "I'm not angry at you, Gloria," she said quietly. "I never was. I just felt sorry for you. All that money, all those nice things, and you still couldn't see what really mattered." She came around the counter and stood in front of the other woman, close enough to touch. "Your son spent 2 weeks washing my dishes. Did he tell you that? A man worth more than this whole town, scrubbing pots and mopping floors, just because he wanted to understand something. He wanted to know if poor people were really as worthless as you and Robert always said." Gloria flinched as if she had been slapped, but Mabel wasn't finished. "And you know what he found? He found that we take care of each other. We share what we have, even when it's not much. We say thank you and please, and I'm here for you. We don't measure people by their bank accounts." She reached out and took Gloria's hand, holding it firmly in her own work-roughened fingers. "It's not too late for you, Gloria. It's never too late to become who you should have been all along." Robert Carter was released from the hospital a week later. Michael paid every bill, arranged for a private nurse, covered the cost of physical therapy, all without ever entering his parents' house again. He was done with words. He was waiting for actions. And on a cool September morning, those actions finally came. Robert walked into Mabel's kitchen, leaning on a cane, moving slowly, but moving. The diner fell silent. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone remembered the town meeting, the humiliation, the contempt he had shown for a woman who only wanted to help others. Robert made his way to the counter and sat down on a stool, his pride visibly warring with something else, something new. Mabel walked over and stood in front of him, waiting. For a long moment, Robert couldn't speak. His jaw worked, his hands gripped the edge of the counter, his eyes refused to meet hers. And then finally, in a voice so quiet it was almost inaudible, he said, "I'll have a bowl of soup, and thank you for everything." Mabel didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of all the terrible things he had said and done. She simply nodded, ladled out a bowl of her homemade chicken soup, and set it in front of him. "You're welcome," she said. And that was all. Sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it comes in a bowl of soup and 2 small words that cost everything to say. Robert ate in silence while the diner slowly returned to its normal hum of conversation. And if anyone noticed the tears running down the old man's weathered face, they had the grace not to mention it. Michael and Ethan left Millbrook 3 days later. They stood beside a rental car, an ordinary sedan, nothing fancy, watching the sun rise over the town that had shaped them both in ways they were still trying to understand. Ethan had asked to say goodbye to Mabel, and he had spent an hour in the diner the night before, hugging the old woman and promising to write, to visit, to never forget what she had taught him about the difference between wealth and worth. Now he stood beside his father, looking back at the town one last time. "Dad," he said quietly, "do you think they'll really change? Grandma and Grandpa, I mean. Do you think they'll remember?" Michael considered the question carefully. He thought about his mother's tears in the hospital, his father's halting apology in the diner, the long and painful journey that had brought them to this moment. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Change is hard. It takes time. And sometimes people disappoint you even when you want to believe in them." He put his hand on Ethan's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of his son beneath his palm. "But I know this. Your mother would have wanted me to give them a chance. She believed everyone deserved a chance to be better, even the people who hurt her the most." Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he asked the question that had been building in him since that day in the hospital, since he had finally learned the truth about how his mother died and who had refused to help. "Are you angry at them? Still?" Michael sighed and looked up at the sky, where the first pink streaks of dawn were fading into blue. "I was," he admitted. "For a long time, I was so angry I could barely breathe. But anger is heavy, son. It weighs you down. It makes you smaller. Your mother used to say that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." He smiled, a small and fragile thing that held echoes of the woman he had loved and lost. She was right about most things. She would have told me not to let them turn me into someone bitter. Someone like them. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this wisdom, storing it away for the years to come when he would need it. "I think I understand," he said. "Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about us." Michael squeezed his son's shoulder. "When did you get so smart?" Ethan grinned, and for a moment he looked exactly like Catherine, the same mischievous sparkle in his eyes, the same crooked smile. "I learned from the best." They got into the car and drove toward the highway. As they passed the sign that marked the edge of town, "Leaving Millbrook, come back soon," Ethan twisted in his seat to look back one last time. "Dad," he said suddenly, "Grandma's standing on the porch." Michael didn't want to look. He had spent 20 years building walls between himself and this place, protecting his heart from the people who had broken it so thoroughly. But something made him glance in the rearview mirror anyway, and he saw her. Gloria, standing on the front porch of the house on Maple Street, one hand raised in the air, waving. She looked smaller than he remembered, older, more fragile, more human. Michael didn't stop the car. He didn't turn around, but almost without thinking, his left hand rose from the steering wheel and lifted through the open window, holding there for just a moment. A wave, a gesture, an acknowledgement of something he couldn't put into words. Then he lowered his hand and fixed his eyes on the road ahead. The miles unwound beneath them like a ribbon, carrying them away from Millbrook and toward whatever came next. Ethan dozed in the passenger seat, exhausted from the weight of everything he had learned and felt over the past 2 weeks. Michael drove in silence, thinking about Catherine, about his parents, about the strange and winding path that had brought him to this moment. He had come to Millbrook looking for an answer, and he had found one, though not the one he had expected. His parents hadn't changed because of money or success or the threat of being cut off forever. They had changed, if they were really changing at all, because they had finally been forced to see themselves clearly, to see what they had become, to stand in front of a mirror that wouldn't lie. And that mirror had been a bowl of soup, a bag of fruit, an old woman who had every reason to hate them but chose kindness instead. The answer, Michael realized, wasn't about his parents at all. It was about him, about who he wanted to be, about whether he would let the past define him or choose his own path forward. He thought about what Ethan had said. Forgiveness isn't about them, it's about us. And he felt something loosen in his chest, some knot that had been there so long he had forgotten it existed. The sun was high now, burning away the last of the morning mist. Ahead, the highway stretched toward a horizon full of possibilities. Behind them, Millbrook was shrinking in the distance, becoming just another small town in the rearview mirror. But it would never really be gone. It would always be part of who Michael was, part of the story that had shaped him into the man he had become. And now, it was part of Ethan's story, too. A chapter about the difference between having money and having character, between what you own and who you are. Michael reached over and turned on the radio, and a country song filled the car with its easy rhythm. Ethan stirred, opening his eyes slowly. "Where are we going?" he asked sleepily. Michael smiled, a real smile this time, not the sad ghost of one he had worn for so long. "Home," he said. "We're going home." And for the first time in 20 years, that word didn't taste like loss. It tasted like possibility, like hope, like the beginning of something new. Some people spend their whole lives chasing wealth, only to discover that the richest person in the room is often the one with the emptiest pockets and the fullest heart. Michael Carter learned this lesson twice, once when he had nothing and the world looked away, and again when he had everything and came back to see if anything had changed. The answer surprised him, not because his parents became perfect overnight, but because he finally understood that their choices didn't have to dictate his own. True wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or stock portfolios. It's measured in the kindness you show to strangers, the loyalty you give to family, and the grace you find to forgive those who hurt you most. That's the inheritance worth passing down. That's the fortune no one can ever take away.